Marhaba and welcome to our session this afternoon on how technological innovation is changing the world. I'm Brandy Scott. I am joined by the award-winning futurist Matthew Griffin, who knows more about what's coming back next than I do because he is a futurist. We're going to have a look at what he thinks we should be doing right now to prepare for the issues and the crises and the challenges that have been being discussed on the main stage here at ADIPEC by the ministers in the great and good of the oil energy this morning. Yeah. We are going to have a Q&A at the end of this session in about 20 minutes. So, Matthew probably already knows what you're going to ask, and he's already prepared his answers because he is, of course, a futurist. But if you can throw a curveball at him, it will amuse me greatly. Matthew, let's start off by talking about COP26, which, ironically, for an oil conference, we have spent a lot of this morning talking about moving away from oil. Been a lot of criticism about the communique that was released, the goals, the pledge, the mandate that came out of COP26. What did you make of it? And what should they have done?
So, by trade, I'm a marine biologist and oceanographer. Fell into technology a very long time ago. I'll answer that in a rather random way. We should really have started the process of limiting climate gases about 30 to 40 years ago. You know, when we have a look at COP26, what we're trying to do is we are now trying to act with this sense of urgency and immediacy to fix the problem that is actually on our doorstep, bearing in mind that 20, 30, 40 years ago, it was very close to our doorstep, and we are now scrambling for solutions in the hope that countries don't drown. Now, from a technology perspective, we have all of the technology that we need in different states of maturity to eliminate 100% of all greenhouse gases. Whether that's methane with cows, whether that's carbon dioxide with energy generation, whether it is agriculture, whether it is transportation, aviation, shipping, logistics, or whether it is heavy industry. We have the solutions today, and we can talk through those. One of the biggest challenges that I see when we have a challenge, a global challenge as a society, is what most people do is they all get together, have a discussion, have a debate, and then all of the aspirations that we actually have typically come down to the lowest common denominator, such as the language on coal, where phase out becomes phase down. Phase down basically is not a locked-in statement. When we talk about, we talked earlier about putting systems in place that either, for example, punish people for not doing things or meeting targets, but then a lot of that gets walked back. So we can use carrot and stick when it comes to things like COP26 and say, well, look, sea levels are rising. If we have a look at extreme weather, since the year 2020, since the year 2000, 1.23 million people have died, 4.6 billion people have been affected. And if we actually just want to talk about it in economic terms, we've had over $3 trillion worth of damage that the insurers have had to pay out for. So we have a carrot. We can do things basically because it is the right thing to do, basically for people on the planet. Or alternatively, we can have a stick, in which case governments come in with regulations, as we see with internal combustion engines, and say, if you aren't going to get rid of internal combustion engines yourselves, we're just going to legislate against them, and by 2030, 2040, depending on the country, you can no longer sell them. There you go, problem solved. So carrot is always better than stick, but inevitably, we tend to have to sort of bring the stick in at some point, which is rather unfortunate.
So what should the energy industry, everybody who is out in these halls, be doing now? We've got people moving to green hydrogen, we've got people moving to blue hydrogen, but we've also got a lot of people saying, oh, it's all about the transition. We need to still be investing in fossil fuel technology because you're going to need energy while we're getting from A to B.
Yeah. So the irony of it is, but when you actually have a look at the global oil and gas industry, two of my first clients were actually top 5 oil and gas giants. They're here today. And what I found quite odd, basically, with the oil and gas industry, sort of back in those days, is one of them came to me basically and said, we have tens of thousands of people within the company, and we want to be able to bring their ideas into the company, and then we want to be able to accelerate those up and out, but we just don't really know how to, on the one hand, foster a culture of innovation, but then we don't really know how to actually accelerate innovation, basically when it comes out the top end of the pipe. The other organization, which is also a top 5, and I had this meeting, basically in London, said, we want to disrupt. And so, okay, what do you want to disrupt? Do you want to disrupt yourselves? Do you want to disrupt your own products? Do you want to disrupt your competition? Do you want to disrupt your industry? And they didn't know. But then, after having a variety of different conversations, they also sort of came up with this, exactly what you sort of said, transition. They said, we are here today. Our shareholders expect this kind of value from us, and we have these kinds of products. We need to get to here, so A to Z. And we're not quite sure where Z is from a strategy and vision perspective. But we also know, basically, that this thing in the middle, crossing the chasm, we don't really know how to do that. We don't have a journey map to go from A to Z. And they are now that particular company basically is now starting to make the transition. They've been using M&A and all these other sort of investment vehicles. You know, when we have a look at the oil and gas industry, it's no secret that the vast majority of shareholders basically and investors are actually starting to, should we say, draw down their positions. So I work with organizations who have about $6 trillion worth of assets under management at any one time. And the innovation should have started decades ago. But when we start having a look at some of the future technologies that we can actually leverage, we're still not investing enough. And it's easy to say we're not investing enough because we aren't. But it's also easy for me to sit here and say we're not investing enough because it's not my money, technically. But when we actually have a look at moving from a predominant oil and gas economy, bearing in mind that in 2020 we saw a 50% uptick in renewable developments. So renewables in 2020, we saw installations of about 250 gigawatts. When we have a look at oil and gas installations, basically they went from 64 gigawatts down to 60 gigawatts, basically, and to quote basically the IEA, they say this is the continuation of a trend to disinvest basically in oil and gas, basically. And when we have a look at net new projects, for example, we now see the unsubsidized cost of solar hitting about $20 to $30 per megawatt hour. The writing's on the wall. As companies, basically, you might not want to transition because the status quo is the comfortable place. That's what you know. That's the culture that you're built on. That's the ecosystem and the partnership communities that you've actually built and you've been exposed to. But the markets are moving away from, for example, oil and gas. In some areas, not all areas, but in some areas, you can either move and you can actually either have a piece of cake basically in the new world, or you can maintain the status quo and you can be the biggest giant basically in a declining industry, where all net new projects basically are typically solar or wind. Bearing in mind that 90% of all renewable energy installations basically are solar and wind. And when we actually have a look at the cost of solar, for example, we can already see a point in time where the cost of generating electricity from solar is 0 or 0.002 billionths of a cent. Same with wind. Go and Google the cost of electricity generation from any renewable energy, and the graph does this. This is an exponential technology graph. Technologies always start off really expensive. They look stupid. They don't really work very well. But over time, costs plummet. And when we actually have a look at solar, for example, basically we have a pathway from where we are today with silicon solar panels to solar concentrators and solar panels that are 132% energy efficient. And we can talk about that.
Where would you put your money then?
In terms of energy?
Well, yeah, when you're talking investment of energy, which new technologies, emerging technologies, would you put your cash in?
Okay. So I'm gonna. You probably guessed basically where I'm going to go. That's it. But I'm going to put a little backdrop to this. So today, basically, we can 3D print nuclear reactors. We've done that at the Department of Energy, complete with nuclear cores. When we have a look at wind, basically, we are scaling up the size of wind turbines, basically, which again reduces the cost of energy generation. So, for example, General Electric have got deep sea wind turbines now. I mean, the largest wind turbines are about 44 stories tall. When we have a look at solar, I'd put my money on solar. But the reason for that is today, if you buy a traditional silicon solar panel, it's what, 17 to 20% energy efficient? The maximum that we can get to silicon solar basically is about 28% energy efficient. Perscovite solar panels basically can get to about 32% energy efficiency. If you actually use hybrid bacteria as they are in China, you can get to 40 to 50% energy efficiency out of a solar panel. You can also generate electricity in cloudy conditions. Now, if you start actually looking at, for example, the Department of Energy has a prototype solar panel that is 48% energy efficient in terms of it's made. You can touch it and feel it and everything else. Bearing in mind, these things have to mature, they have to commercialize, and then costs come down again. If I put carbon nanotubes into a solar panel, into a silicon solar panel, and reclaim the heat, I get a solar panel that is 80% energy efficient. And if I use a couple of different exponential technologies and I 3D print a new nanophotonic material, then I can capture all the tiniest wavelengths of light, and I can create a solar panel using something called black silicon that is 132% energy efficient. And when that comes to the market, it won't be 132% energy efficient because it'll lose some of its efficiency. However, if I slap graphene over the top of a solar panel, I can now generate electricity when it's raining and when it's snowing. If I can create a nanophotonic material, which we've already done, I can generate electricity, and we've already done this, from ambient light and moonlight. At which point, the whole conversation about grid-scale storage, battery backups as boost, starts going away.
So you're not putting your money in batteries then? Or in the solar storage technology?
I mean, there's a lot moving based on batteries, but solar's the main one. Because if you actually have a look, so if you have a look at, for example, electric vehicles today, we've got lithium-ion batteries. Basically, the energy density of those have been increasing at a decent rate. It's been accelerating as we see investment flowing in. We can 3D print a traditional lithium-ion battery, basically, and that has 400% more energy density than a traditional ion battery. And it charges 500% faster. Add graphene in and you accelerate that curve again. When we actually have a look at things like metal air batteries, so for example, aluminium, aluminium basically has an energy density of 23,000 mH per liter, which blows hydrogen out of the water. It blows methanol out of the water. And then when we have a look at batteries, we've got bio-batteries, we've got structured batteries. Structured batteries is where you turn the car itself basically into the battery. So you have carbon fiber that's woven with carbon nanotubes. The car itself is the battery. Then we have wireless energy generation from New Zealand. That's it. So MCOR, basically over in New Zealand, have created long-range wireless transmission systems that operate at the megawatt scale. So we're already starting, even in the EV space, we have lithium-ion batteries. Using artificial intelligence, I can improve the energy efficiency of your vehicle by 20 to 30%, as well as a Google hyperscale data center. We then start moving to wireless charging. BMW are already creating wirelessly charged vehicles. That means that we don't need as many lithium-ion batteries, so we can get rid of some of them, but not all of them. We have states in the US, Michigan, for example, who are creating wireless charging infrastructure, streets, roads, all that kind of different stuff. If we have companies like Hyundai, Toyota, Lightyear One, we now have flexible photovoltaic materials, and we have an artificial intelligence that's actually designing a spray-on photovoltaic material, where you now have a car that doesn't need any form of battery at all because it's got PV materials covering it. Bearing in mind that PV energy efficiency is here and it's going up here. So when we have a look at the future of EV, and it's a whole conversation in itself, basically we already see a way to transition off lithium-ion batteries, and there are companies, big global automotive companies, that are already doing it.
Okay, so talk to me about timescale and how we make sure that everyone benefits from this.
Yeah.
Off the back of COP26, we've got countries saying you can't push us to move away from coal, we can't condemn our sizable populations to poverty.
Yeah.
So, to talk Jetsons flying cars or the solar equivalent, how do we get everyone from A to B, and what kind of time are we realistically
So
talking?
you've got to lower the cost of manufacture. So with a lot of these technologies, I mean, some of them are actually really cheap anyway to deploy, and we're deploying them today. But generally, you need those technologies to be cheap to produce. You need to be able to manufacture them at scale. This is where, from a government perspective, you can actually offer it tax incentives, basically, as well as, carrot and stick. So it's, I mean, if you have a look at India, for example, one of the biggest problems they have moving off coal is, in some areas, there's no centralized energy grid. So at some point, the Indian government are going to have to say, right, so we've got all of these different areas off the grid, same with Africa. How do we connect them to the grid? In which case, on the one hand, you don't necessarily need to connect them to the grid because you can just drop renewables basically into a local center, basically, and off you go. You've got microgrids, you've got fully autonomous energy grids if you really want to go down the Dutch route, for example. It comes down to, on the one hand, regulations, government policies. If you can no longer buy the polluting thing, then you can't buy it. For example, some of the problems that we actually see in Africa is there's a lot of pollution, and there's actually a lot of health problems basically in Africa because they actually cook on open stoves. So there are different ways to hit it. But fundamentally, we have the technology. Mm-hmm. The problem is deployment and investment. According to Bloomberg Net, basically, if we want to hit net zero by 2050, we need to invest $92 trillion. We're investing $1.7 trillion a year at the minute, and we need to actually invest around $3 to $6 trillion per year. We're way off those targets. If you have a look at the United Nations' own matrices against, where we are against the UN SDG, the 17 UN SDG goals, that's it. 75% of all of the markers are red. Even the United Nations basically say that, we are generally way off goal on most things, whether it's future of water, future of food, whether it's, energy. But again, we have solutions, it's investment, which then means that we actually look at things like the European Big Green Deal. So when we actually go to the investors, whether it's Citi, Legal & General, BlackRock, we now have over $34 trillion worth of ESG assets under management. By 2025, it's estimated that ESG assets under management, AUM, will actually account for about $50 trillion, which is over 30% of all global assets. So we are moving. This is the thing. It's the positive message is we have solutions. We are moving, but the problem is we're not moving fast enough, which then brings me back down to the, when the US president, I forgot his name, Michael Gore, not Michael Gore.
US president at the moment, the one before that, the one before that?
Oh, I knew it earlier. That's it. That's my memory for me. So, in 20 to 30 years ago, basically, there was Al Gore. There you go. 20 to 30 years ago, basically, Al Gore basically created a video basically saying, we need to act on climate now. And pretty much he got laughed at. We saw Michael Moore basically with Fahrenheit basically going, we're going to hit this warming curve here, carbon dioxide's increasing in the atmosphere. That was a niche program. As humans, as human society, we are really, really good, like the pandemic, at starting to do something when the wolf is already at the door. Bill Gates was talking about the pandemic years ago. If you want to create the next pandemic as a futurist, I can show you the technology. In fact, the World Health Organization was shown the technology about 3 years ago, where researchers in Canada took $100,000, reverse engineered basically the extinct horsepox virus, which has an R rating of 3 to 5, which makes COVID basically look like a lame duck. And they showed it to the World Health Organization and the leaders at the time who went, And if you really want to Google that one, the World Health Organization went on record basically and said what was most remarkable basically about this particular innovation was that they managed to de-extinct the horsepox virus even though they didn't really have much money, resources, or skill. We need, as a society, we need to get away from this, there is something coming, let's wait until it comes. And even on the sustainability perspective, I tend to argue, are we actually trying to create a sustainable world from, say, an ESG perspective, or a regenerative one? Because if you believe Greta Thunberg, she quoted a little while ago, our house is burning down. Now, if we get to net zero, bearing in mind the loss of biodiversity, extreme weather, all these kinds of rising sea levels, which actually affects basically future water and all these kinds of bits and bobs. What we're going to do basically is we are going to stop our house burning down, but we're still going to end up basically with a burnt out house. So are we actually looking to create a sustainable future from where we are today, or are we actually looking to start regenerating the planet and the societies that we have? Because the two are really very different. And we can do both. And there are ways to actually create a regenerative society over just a sustainable society as well. And even when we have a look at things like the future of water that we were talking about earlier, if you take 3D printing, bearing in mind a lot of these new advanced technologies can do some really amazing things when you combine them with human ingenuity. We've already managed to 3D print, multiple things, but we've been able to 3D print a heat exchanger. This heat exchanger, it's not sexy tech. However, it draws 500 litres of water out of the atmosphere, anywhere. You can be in the middle of the desert, it draws out about 3 litres of water per day in the middle of the desert. Bahrain, when I was in Bahrain recently, they have, 90% humidity? So when we talk about the future of water, we sort of talked about desalination earlier. There are different technologies coming through there. There are other technologies coming that let us do new things in new ways and get over water's distribution problem. Future of food. In the UAE, I've talked basically a lot to government ministers about the future of food. The UAE is a net importer of food. About 97-98% of the food that we're actually eating today basically is imported. The reason for that is because we essentially live in a big desert, really, sand, but desert. I can take the stem cell, or I can take a cell from the chicken feather, put it into something called a bioreactor, and I can grow chicken nuggets in the middle of the desert. I can take vegetables and I can put them into a container or into a warehouse, create a vertical farm that uses 99% less potable water. If I use a hydro panel, which is a type of solar panel and water panel, then these farms can use 100% less potable water while producing organic crops that are 8 times the yield. And you have some of those in Masdar as well as down the Sheikh Zayed Road. We have solutions for global famine, the global water shortage, and, should we say, GHG/energy. As always, the general problem is investment and deployment. And there are ways that we can actually legislate for that. There are policies that we can actually create to encourage the move and the transition, because the transition is difficult. And there's a role for both public and private partnership.
And we've got about 2 minutes left. Let's extend that out to 4 or 5. Do we have any questions for Matthew Griffin, our futurist, on the stage today before we wrap up, which he shall answer succinctly? Anybody? Right, with that, I will thank you, Matthew, for coming. Award-winning futurist and a man who says he has the answers. Thank you very much for your time.
We need to do. Having the answers is fine.
The doing?
But you need to do.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Cheers.